They say money makes the world go round. But what if I told you one currency doesn't just move the world, but it controls it? A hidden power lies at the heart of our global financial system. Invisible, silent, and devastatingly effective. No armies, no invasions, just numbers on a screen. And when the US decides to use it, entire nations fall in line or fall apart. Yes, I'm talking about the US dollar, the code that runs the global economy. A digital leash wrapped around countries, companies, and even entire governments. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain and explaining how the United States turned the dollar into a geopolitical operating system and one of the most powerful weapons ever known to mankind. Before we dive in, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Blackbook Economist for more unconventional insights and bold economic truths you won't find anywhere else. The United States holds a unique position in global finance by controlling key systems like SWIFT, CHIPS, Fedwire, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Bank for International Settlements. These systems form the arteries of the international economy, enabling cross-border payments, debt servicing, financial surveillance, and institutional lending. At the core of all these networks is the US dollar. Whoever controls the system sets the rules, and the United States has built the infrastructure on which the global financial system runs. This dominance was cemented after World War II, when the US emerged as the world's largest economy and the architect of the Bretton Woods system. It created institutions like the International Monetary Fund and a World Bank, made the dollar the anchor of global exchange, and positioned itself at the center of post-war reconstruction. Even after the gold standard collapsed, the world remained locked into dollar-based trade and finance. The result? A system where the US sets the terms and everyone else plays by them. Because the dollar is globally accepted, everyone uses it in all corners of the world, and transactions are seamless, American corporations enjoy an enormous advantage in expanding abroad. Tech giants like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft operate with minimal friction, while companies like Netflix easily monetize international subscribers. This financial dominance spills into cultural influence, as people around the world use US payment platforms, subscribe to US services, and consume American media. The dominance of the dollar creates a financial highway for US ideas and products to flood the globe. There are around 180 currencies in the world, which is a large enough number that, in terms of global trade, it would look like barter if they all swapped their currencies around when trading goods and services. Instead, money has a strong network effect, where liquidity regenerates more liquidity, and acceptability regenerates more acceptability, leading to one or two major saleable currencies rather than most of them. As such, the way it works in practice is that the dollar is the foundational money for most of the world when dealing with anything international. If an entity in Japan agrees to buy a set amount of commodities from an entity in Brazil, for example, it'll often be priced in dollars even though it's neither of their home currencies. It's the biggest and most ubiquitous global ledger that they both agree to use. In addition to this, in the 1970s, following the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members to price oil exclusively in dollars, a system known as the petrodollar. This meant that any country needing oil had to first acquire dollars, boosting global demand. Over time, other essential commodities followed suit. Since major exchanges like the New York Mercantile Exchange and the Intercontinental Exchange are dollar-denominated, and dollar liquidity is unmatched, the dollar became the de facto currency of trade. This reinforced a system where the US dollar is not only a medium of exchange, but also a strategic asset. And with most global trade, especially in oil and essential commodities, conducted in dollars, the US has indirect control over the rules of trade. This is more than just economic conveniences. By controlling the unit of transaction, the US can regulate what, how, and with whom trade happens globally. Since so much international business is done in dollars, that money usually has to pass through American financial institutions, whether that's for settling trade, transferring funds, or investing. Think of it like this. If two foreign companies want to trade in dollars, they often need to route the payment through a US bank or a US-based payment system. Each time that happens, American banks charge fees for processing, converting, or holding the money. Multiply that by millions of transactions, and it turns into a vast and steady income stream. But it's not just about fees. US financial firms also get to see what's flowing through their systems. That gives them access to exclusive financial data, who's buying what, from where, and in what amounts. This information is incredibly valuable for predicting markets, tailoring services, and staying ahead of competitors. Meanwhile, because the dollar is seen as stable and in high demand, American corporations can borrow money more easily and at lower interest rates than their foreign competitors. This creates a powerful feedback loop. More dollar use globally means more business for US banks and corporations. Stronger US banks and corporations means more products, platforms, and investments that promote dollar use around the world. For example, companies like Apple and Google don't just sell phones or stream shows. They also provide digital payment systems, cloud infrastructure, and global platforms that default to US financial systems. As these firms grow internationally, they pull even more users into the dollar-based ecosystem. In this way, Wall Street and Silicon Valley become twin engines of American economic influence, all powered by the dollar. The US dominates the IMF and World Bank largely because of the dollar. It can influence who gets loans and under what conditions. The US has disproportionate control over global institutions like the IMF and World Bank, largely because of its dollar-based contributions. In the IMF, the US holds about 16.5% of the voting power, and since major decisions require an 85% supermajority, the US effectively has veto power. The World Bank follows a similar structure. The largest share of voting power and financial contribution ensures that US interests are woven into the DNA of global development and financial assistance. Having in mind that over 58% of global reserves are held in USD as of 2024, many countries need dollars to pay debts, import oil and key commodities, and intervene in their currency markets. When emerging markets run short on dollars, they cannot borrow domestically or use their own currency internationally. They are pushed to the IMF, where the US has a veto and influence. This dependency gives the US a choke point over financial lifelines. When countries are in crisis, they need dollars, and the IMF controls the tap, while the US holds the faucet. And these loans often come with structural adjustment conditions that reflect Washington consensus principles and US economic ideology. Fiat currency systems, like the one we are using today, are primarily based on ever-growing debt levels. They're like the subset of sharks that have to keep swimming forward or they die. But in this case, they have to keep nominally growing or they collapse. The money supply continuously grows in every country for this reason. The dollars outside of the United States are no different. It's a debt-based global dollar system, and they need ever-growing numbers of dollars to stay afloat. To put this into perspective, when a fractional reserve bank lends money, it actually creates broad money in the process. Thus, it increases the ratio of broad money to base money in the financial system whenever the bank makes a loan. However, that act of lending doesn't make enough extra money to cover the future interest owed on that loan. If a Japanese dollar lender agrees to lend another entity $100 million in exchange for $10 million of interest in 3 years, then this raises the question of how that other entity will get these extra $10 million if the amount of dollars is more or less fixed. In other words, the banks create dollars when they give out loans, but dollars are not created from scratch for entities that need to repay them. If the entity a successful global corporation, then it will probably be fine. But this raises a bigger question for the system as a whole, because if every company or borrower in the world has to pay back more dollars than they borrowed, where does that extra money come from? According to data points from the Bank for International Settlements, there is additionally about $18 trillion worth of dollar-denominated debt outside of the United States, of which about $13 trillion is owed by non-banks, and that's excluding derivatives. The problem is, there are only about 5.8 trillion base dollars in existence. Just in terms of loans and securities, without derivatives, there are about 20 times as many liabilities for dollars as the number of unlevered dollars that exist. Everything else is just promises built on promises. This can cause major problems for foreign governments and companies. Suddenly, they have to spend more of their local currency to repay the same amount of dollar debt. It's like their loan got bigger overnight. At the same time, higher interest rates in the US can slow down the global economy, reduce investment, and pull money away from emerging markets. This is why, over the long term, the US dollar has tended to appreciate against most other world currencies, apart from a handful like the euro, Swiss franc, and Singapore dollar. This persistent strength of the dollar makes the trap even tighter, reinforcing America's quiet leverage over the global financial system. The end result? Many countries find themselves stuck. They suffer when the dollar rises or when rates go up, but they can't stop using it either. Their economies rely on dollar-based trade, debt, and reserves. Even when the system hurts them, walking away from it would cause even more pain. Because so much global trade and finance flows through the US banking system or dollar clearing networks, the US government can effectively police much of the world's economic activity. If the US Treasury blacklists a person, company, or country, it can block them from accessing the dollar system. This is often done through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which maintains a list of sanctioned entities. For example, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the US and allies froze about $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves and banned major Russian banks. The ruble initially plunged by over 40%, and Russia's ability to conduct international trade was severely restricted, leading to a contraction of its economy and a spike in inflation. A more extreme example is the US sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector and financial system have blocked the country from accessing dollars, contributing to a 73% collapse in GDP from 2013 to 2022, and hyperinflation exceeding 10 million % at its peak. This kind of economic warfare can cripple economies without firing a single bullet. No dollar access means no trade, no capital, and eventually, economic collapse. When a crisis happens, whether it's a local crisis or a global one, everyone rushes not to gold, not to euros, but to the dollar. And this happens even with those crises that begin in the US. This counterintuitive phenomenon reinforces the dollar's dominance. Even when America causes global problems, it profits from being the port in the storm because the US Treasury market is the largest and most liquid financial market in the world. Investors know that they can always buy and sell American government bonds in huge volumes without moving the price much. This liquidity is unmatched by any other asset, including gold or the euro. This ties to the safe haven status, and it's perhaps the most powerful aspect of having the dollar as a weapon. Crises draw capital into US markets. Investors buy American treasuries, strengthening the dollar and giving the US even more financial ammunition. In effect, global chaos becomes a reinforcing cycle of American economic might. During the 2008 global financial crisis, investors rushed to buy US treasuries. Despite the crisis originating in the US, the yield on the 10-year treasury fell from over 4% to below 2.5% as prices soared due to massive demand. The dollar index climbed more than 20% in a matter of months. This effectively made borrowing for the US government even cheaper, despite the fact that its debt was already ridiculously high. Because of this unique phenomenon, the US has the unique power to export its own risk and inflation to the rest of the world, and to import stability from the rest of the world in the form of investments in its debt, real assets, and equity markets. Thanks to global dollar demand, the US can print vast amounts of money to fund stimulus, war, or bailouts, and other countries absorb the inflation. Typically, printing large amounts of money leads to inflation. But when the US prints dollars, global demand for those dollars absorbs much of the impact. As a result, inflation is effectively exported abroad, while capital from other nations, even those with stable economies, flows into US treasuries. This not only strengthens America's financial position, but also allows it to import a degree of economic stability from the rest of the world. Trade deficits occur when a nation imports more goods and services than it exports. When this occurs for brief periods of time, it's fine. That happens frequently. There are all sorts of reasons why a nation might have a trade deficit or a trade surplus during a given period of time. In some rarer cases, even long periods of trade deficits can be okay, as long as the flow of funds that makes up the trade deficit mainly goes towards the productive build-out of the country. The key example of this is India, which has run trade deficits for decades. It's one of the fastest-growing nations, has achieved tremendous economic growth over the past few decades, and overall, the trade deficit is not mainly about overconsumption. In this case, the country's GDP can greatly outgrow its trade deficit, which shrinks the trade deficit relative to GDP over time. With the United States, this is not the case, but they have the world's reserve currency. And because the world needs US debt instruments like treasury bonds, the US can run massive deficits. Its military, social programs, and economic rescues are all partly funded by selling debt to other nations. Yet this doesn't result in currency collapse, because demand for dollars remains insatiable. This allows the US to defy traditional economic logic. Under normal conditions, a country with a large budget and trade deficits would see its currency weaken. But the US is an exception. The twin deficits theory doesn't apply because global demand for dollars overwhelms textbook expectations. America's economic status is upheld not by performance, but by structural dominance. With low borrowing costs and global dollar demand, the US can outspend rivals on defense and finance its ever-growing defense costs with borrowed money from the very system it controls. Think of it as a self-reinforcing loop. The dollar enables power, and power entrenches the dollar. This entire system forms a closed feedback loop. Every advantage the US gains through dollar dominance feeds back into strengthening the dollar itself. From trade to tech, finance to the battlefield, the dollar isn't just currency, it's infrastructure, ideology, and influence. This is how the US turned its currency into a geopolitical operating system. That sounds like a pretty sweet deal for Americans, right? The problem is that this common description misses the next step. What does the rest of the world do with that paper or electronic digits that they receive in exchange for their goods? The answer is that they buy American assets, including stocks, bonds, private equity, and real estate. As a result, foreigners increasingly own more US assets. In practice, we're not trading worthless paper for real goods and services. We're selling stakes in valuable, appreciating capital assets to buy depreciating goods and services. It's the financial equivalent of a snake eating its own tail, making the dollar not just a powerful weapon against others, but also a potential danger to the US itself. How long this system can continue remains to be seen.